Lecture 4, One Body. The pictures on the right, as you might guess, have something to do with the theme of this lecture, and it will become even clearer in a bit. I start this lecture with a discussion of the metaphor of being of one body with the 10,000 things. I want to point out what I take to be a value in its deployment by the Neo-Confucians, along with pointing out what I cannot take from its deployment. I use this as an occasion for discussing how one can admire and deeply respect a philosophical tradition, and at the same time start down an alternative branch of development than the ones that actually developed from that tradition. The first thing I would like to carry from the Neo-Confucians is an important dimension of what it means to be of one body with other things, which is our interdependency with all things. I argue that this is an important rationale for the ideal of harmony, and in particular, the dimensions of accommodation and contest, for which I have argued in the previous lecture. At the same time, I argue that a realistic view of the extent to which one can analogize from what is true of what we ordinarily call one-body organisms, such as individual human beings, to larger social bodies containing such organisms will lead us to differentiate degrees and kinds of interdependency. Second, I would like to carry from the Neo-Confucians and Jushi in particular, the emphasis on Zhong, which I translate as doing one's best in serving others, and Shu, which I translate as sympathetic understanding. For Jushi, Shu is a crucial method for becoming Ren, though not to be identified with Ren itself. This is a method that was highlighted by Confucius in the Analects, but got somewhat de-emphasized later in the classical era. I propose a renewal of attention to it, especially in connection to extending the unmediated and intimate response to the suffering of one's child as if it were one's own suffering, to the suffering of those outside the family. One idea from the Analects that continued to receive great emphasis going forward, especially in the Mengzi, is that the path to developing Ren must go through extending the caring between family members to others outside the family. At the same time, it seems to me that one of the greatest weaknesses in the impressive body of writings of Confucians on moral cultivation is precisely the failure to specify practical educational and ritual practices that could accomplish this extension of care beyond the family. That which I choose not to carry from the Neo-Confucians is their metaphysical conception of Li, or pattern. The metaphysical commitments behind this conception are simply too extensive for me, at least to endorse. I shall address a defense of these commitments as explanatory rather than foundational of the ethical and political meanings of the one-body view. I argue that while construing the metaphysical commitments as explanatory rather than as foundational for the ethical and political meanings, serves to distance us from the metaphysical commitments, relegating the commitments to a less central role, has the effect of throwing us back on relying on intuitions to endorse the moral and political meanings of one body. And such intuitions are not by any means firm or widespread. This does not mean that a moral and political philosophy can do without any metaphysics at all. I propose a more modest metaphysics of interdependency that is in accord with the degrees of and kinds of interdependency. This kind of metaphysics is more in accord with Xunzi's and the Taoist conception of Tian. In the last sections of this lecture, I discussed the implications of what I take from the Neo-Confucians and what I don't for the conception of harmony I argued for in lecture 3. The more complex and differentiated conception of interdependence I propose is, I argue, more in accord with a kind of harmony that promotes contest and accommodation along with shared understanding. I discuss some rituals, delete that I propose, I discuss some rituals that go along with these elements, and they are not the ones that the classical Confucians had in mind. I make an argument for them that they are appropriate for our time. I'm being one body with a myriad creatures. In Jushi and Wang Yangming, the metaphor of being of one body with the myriad creatures clearly resonates with the body metaphor discussed in lectures 1 and 2, which relates the internal organization within the body of the individual human being to the body politic. The body metaphor in Mengzi and Xunzi is primarily deployed to articulate the proper organization of rule within the individual person and the body politic. In Jushi and Wang Yangming, the metaphor takes on the dimension of sensitivity of one part to the condition of the other parts. We may detect an ancestral relation here to Mengzi's sprout of compassion, which includes sensitivity to harm to others. There is also a relation to the image of parents and children who are like one body divided into two. And here the relevance of my pictures. A parent has a deep connection to their child, such that they experience injury to the child as if it were their own injury, to the child's pain as if it were their own pain. As Shun points out, the deep connection between parent and child, Kwang Loi Shun, that deep connection exhibits the qualities of being intimate and unmediated. It is intimate in the sense of experiencing the other's pain as if it were one's own. And it is unmediated in the sense that it is a direct response to the other's situation without being further explained by some other concern. Both these qualities are demonstrated by Mengzi's case of the adult moved by compassion upon seeing a child about to fall into a well. This response might arise not just from parent-child relationship, but other relationships in which at least one party feels special responsibility and accountability for the other party. Indeed, it is the kind of response Mengzi urges upon King Shan of Qi, pointing out that if he can have that reaction to an ox being led to ritual slaughter, he can surely have it to his people suffering. The ultimate goal is to have intimate and unmediated responses to the suffering of all others. In Mengzi's case, it is to all other human beings, and for Jushi and Wang Yangming, it is the myriad creatures. Wang Yangming famously holds that human beings can feel concern and regret upon seeing a stone or a tile broken. Now, this is where one might choose to part company with Neo-Confucian metaphysics. Perhaps the Neo-Confucians are right, but neither they nor the Buddhists, whose doctrine of the omnipresence of the Buddha nature in sentient beings influence the Neo-Confucians, give one a reason apart from their extensive metaphysics to adopt that view. However, they depict an admirable ideal of deep connection between human beings. Does the Neo-Confucian metaphysics of pattern provide a way to understand the basis of such a deep connection? The Neo-Confucian metaphysics behind the idea of one body. Much of Jushi's metaphysics centers on the relation between Li, pattern or the fit and coherence between all things, and Qi, the material force or energy stuff from which objects emerge and return at the end of their existence. How Jushi conceives this relation is a matter of interpretive debate, but I operate on the understanding of Li not as ontologically prior to Qi, but rather as being a pattern or deep structure that is immanent within and expressed by Qi, and delineates the range and possibilities of Qi's transformations. Others have noted that Li appears to have both subjective and objective aspects. It lays down the lines along which everything moves in a way that is independent of personal desires. But on the other hand, it is related to the pattern of one's profoundest responses to things. With regard to qi, Juxi holds that even though goodness is within human nature, individuals differ with respect to their native endowment of energy stuff, and that this, together with differences in their family and social circumstances, affects the development of their good natures. The qi with which people begin varies in its clarity. Some have especially turbid qi, which means that they will have to work harder to make the pattern already within them manifest. Making it manifest involves recognizing our deep connection to others. Because we all have the same pattern, we are parts of a harmonious whole and form one body with other human beings and the other myriad creatures. The virtue of Ren is based on this shared pattern. The analogy Chang Hao gave to lack of Ren is numbness of feeling in one's hand and foot. When one is not numb, one feels throughout one's whole body, and this is Ren. When one is not numb, one feels throughout one's whole body, and this is Ren. A person of Ren will therefore be of one body with the myriad creatures. As I read the one body metaphor, it is not claiming that the myriad creatures are all literally the same creature. It is rather that all creatures are connected in one body. Then what does it mean to form one body? At the least, the idea expresses the interdependence and interconnection of all creatures in the way that different parts of organic body are interdependent and interconnected. But different parts of a body are not the same as each other, even though they belong to the same body. They belong to the same body in virtue of sharing in the same pattern. It must be possible to distinguish the creatures as different parts of the one body, since the Neo-Confucians believe that important distinctions rest on the different relationships in which we stand to one another. For example, Wang Yangming holds that even though we human beings can feel concern and regret upon seeing a stone or tile broken, human beings are more vital to the world than tiles and stones. He points to the analogy of using one's hands and feet to protect one's head and eyes, to indicate such differences in significance. In discussion of the Daxia, great learning, which appears to advocate different degrees of care towards the myriad creatures, Wong tells a student that it is right to feed grasses and trees to animals, even though we love grasses and trees, and that it is right to kill birds and animals to feed parents, sacrifice for rituals, and to entertain guests, even though we love birds and animals. If you go back to Mengzi's example, the person who reacts with compassion toward the child about to fall into the well is not the child, but only has that deep connection to the child. If the myriad creatures are not identical to one another, then in what does their relationship of being one body consist in? Perhaps interdependence. They affect one another and their welfare is tied to the welfare of the others, as the different parts of one body have a common good, that is the good of the whole body. Their welfare is tied together so that they are capable of experiencing an injury to another as if it were an injury to self. That at least is one plausible interpretation of what it means for the myriad creatures to be of one body. The interdependence between parts of a biological organism can be scaled upwards to construe an ecological system, such as a forest, an ocean, or even the earth, as one body. This idea can be spelled out in different ways as applied to such different entities by referring to such factors as the degree and nature of the relationships of mutual influence involved, and the nature of the parts involved and how they come to make up the whole. As indicated by Wang's example of the hands and feet, some parts may be more or less crucial to the continued functioning of the whole. Thus, interdependence can have a normative dimension in the sense that the parts work together for the good of the whole, and the good of each part goes into the constitution of the good of the whole. Parts can be ordered in hierarchical importance, such that the loss of some of the parts, more than the loss of others, might impair the whole's ability to realize the good of the whole. However, the nature of the interdependence within a whole can involve such sufficiently tight binding together of all the parts that no loss can fail to reverberate throughout the whole. Hence the imagery of feeling what happens to another as if it happened to a part of one's own body. The idea of interdependence is quite relevant for us. At the time of this writing, I am speaking from a nation with the most plentiful resources on earth. Yet it lost over 500,000 lives, in part because too many of its people in this pandemic were and are still acting as if their actions affect only themselves, and as if their welfare depends only on their own actions. The challenges facing us include not just the deadly pandemic, but even more deadly climate change and the stark gulf between those with little opportunity for sustaining and meaningful livelihood and those with obscene excess and power over others that no one ought to have. In short, some may affirm our interdependence, but many are unable or unwilling to act that way. Acknowledging and making use of our interdependence on each other has to be the first step in recovering our failures. And so the Confucian idea of the one body has urgent relevance to this task. Of course, it is open to question how far we should go with the Neo-Confucians in affirming the organic nature of our interdependence with each other. For every human being to have the capacity to register in intimate and unmediated fashion injury to any other creature in the world is literally an infinitely large metaphysical commitment to make. The claim that we have the latent capacity for concern or regret over a broken tile or stone that has, let us say, previously fallen from a roof makes clear the extent of the commitment. One natural reaction to have is that the concern or regret is based on the sense that some human being put effort and thought into making that which is now broken. But Stephen Angle has replied that, quote, at the core of this objection to Wong's expansive vision is an unwillingness to see ourselves as fundamentally a part of the world we experience, unquote. We need not project a sentient being's interest as it relates to the tile to recognize that, as Angle says, each person, animal, plant, and tile exists in a web of interrelationships that structures the cosmos. However, interrelationship does not underwrite the existence of sensitivity to any change in the cosmos whatsoever, nor does it explain why it makes sense to have concern or regret for something that does not have sentience, and if we are not considering the interest that sentient beings might have in that thing. Nor is it to take into account degrees and kinds of interdependence. Jung Huang presents a different kind of defense of Neo-Confucian metaphysics as explanatory rather than foundational. The foundational approach, which Huang views as central to traditional Western metaphysics, is to construct a metaphysical system independent of empirical and practical knowledge, and then to derive from it everything empirical and practical. By contrast, explanatory metaphysics starts from empirical and/or practical knowledge and aims to explain it. It starts from, for example, deep and strong moral instincts, and then argues that for these instincts to be possible, true, and coherent, there must be something that makes them be so. In the Chinese tradition, Huang points to Juxi's metaphysics as explanatory in this sense. Ju starts from a Mengzian view that human beings have the four virtues and are alone among the myriad creatures in being able to exercise them. He conceives of the four sprouts as manifestations of their origin or root, which are the four virtues. The feelings of the sprouts are human nature aroused, as in shames emerging from human nature by the perception of a wrongful act. Thus conceived, an explanatory metaphysic is to be evaluated according to its power to explain our deep and strong moral instincts in the context of our empirical knowledge of ourselves and the world. Explanatory metaphysics pretty much corresponds to metaphysics as it is done now in the West, where the explananda are deep and strong intuitions and beliefs about what there is in the world, considered in the context of empirical knowledge. Sometimes, however, issues arise as to whether the empirical knowledge might undermine some deep and strong intuitions and beliefs, such as common sense intuitions about the nature of material objects, space, and time. In fact, the unexpected findings of empirical knowledge, and in particular of the sciences, have weighed in favor of the explanatory rather than the foundational approach. That is, the findings of the sciences have undermined our confidence in treating such intuitions and beliefs as secure a priori foundations for metaphysics. Such findings are compatible with explaining why we have the intuitions and beliefs we do, but that doesn't mean that they are true or warranted, given what we know now. A scientific understanding of why we experience the physical world as we do might explain why our perceptual experience of mid-sized material objects conduce to the kind of intuitions and beliefs we have, and at the same time reveal a molecular, atomic, and subatomic structure that is startlingly different from our experience on the perceptual level. The same might hold true of any intuitions we may have of the world as having a pattern consisting in how things fit together and are interdependent. So, while it is possible for Neo-Confucian metaphysics to be validated by the explanatory approach, it's also quite possible that alternative explanations will arise and have already arisen. In fact, one basis for an alternative approach comes from Xunzi. It's no accident that the Neo-Confucians elevated Mengzi, since his teachings were much congenial to be somewhat revised and extended into what would become Orthodox Neo-Confucianism than Xunzi's teachings were. My own approach to a metaphysics of morality resonates with Xunzi in important respects, even if it draws from some of Mengzi's teachings about human nature. The important respects of resonance with Xunzi concern the idea that it is human beings who establish the content, not only of ritual, but of what is right and appropriate, in accordance with their determinations of how certain desires must be regulated so that desires in general may be satisfied, and how other desires and emotions conducive to social cooperation must be strengthened and channeled in certain directions in accordance with Yi and Li, ritual. They also devise to help transform their nature. In other words, the kind of order they devised was of distinctively human origin and not of a piece with the order of the rest of the world. This is how, in Xunzi's view, humanity forms a triad with heaven and earth. The human order is coordinated and integrated with the order of heaven and earth, in the sense that to fulfill human desire, one needs to, from Xunzi, plow in the spring, weed in the summer, harvest in the fall, and store in the winter. To be vigilant in the seasonal prohibitions concerning ponds, rivers, and marshes, and not to miss the proper time to cut and nurture. With these significant complications noted, it seems to me that the explanatory approach is the right one, but whether it ends up confirming a Neo-Confucian metaphysic, that should read confirming, is a very open question. We can ask what deep and firm intuitions and beliefs we have about our interdependence, both among human beings with other sentient beings and with the things in the world at large. But we must do this with great awareness of the variety in conceptions, not only of how our well-being as human beings is bound up with the well-being of other sentient creatures and non-sentient creatures, especially the non-sentient, but also with respect to the priorities and importance accorded to various groups. Certainly, there would be lots of dissent now to Wong's acceptance of killing non-human animals for food or ritual sacrifice. We might not get the kind of pattern that the Neo-Confucians had in mind, but we might very well get something that is compatible with a more complex kind of harmony that is advocated in the previous lecture. A harmony that integrates shared understanding with contest and accommodation of differences. For this kind of harmony, it may suffice to recognize forms of interdependence that do not require extensive metaphysical commitments. We are, as Engels says in defense of Wong, part of the world we experience. And it is equally important that the world is part of us. Regarding our interdependence with other human beings, many of our deepest and strongest intuitions indicate that our constituting traits, those going into who we are, involve dispositions that are triggered by specific persons in specific social contexts. As Confucians well recognize, we typically do not act in one uniform way towards everyone and anyone and across all contexts. Our tendencies to respond to the world in certain ways, our tendencies to respond to relatively localized parts of the world, to these people rather than to others. We act in one way towards some people and different ways towards others. And these varying ways of acting towards others often correspond to our social roles. In Analects 10.1, Confucius is described as submissive and seemingly inarticulate in the local community, while fluent in the ancestral temple and at court, though he did not speak lightly. In 10.2, he is described as affable at court with counselors of lower rank, frank though respectful with counselors of upper rank, and respectful and composed when with his lower. For a contemporary example of situational sensitive traits, consider that people might manifest certain traits when with family and close friends, but manifest very different traits when with colleagues. People may be warm and generous with their friends and family, respectful and reserved with their colleagues. This does not mean that we only bear the mark of influence by those in our smaller, more intimate circles. Yuri Bronfenbrenner's influential biological theory of human development acknowledges the influence of these smaller circles, yet explains how processes in larger, encompassing circles interact with what happens in the smaller circles closer to the individual. What he calls microsystems, home, school, workplace, and peer groups, are the small circles of interaction that directly influence the development of the individual. But individuals belong to more than one such circle, and the ways that processes within each circle interact through their influence on individuals and the interactions between microsystems are shaped by the larger encompassing systemic circles. For example, parents may be influenced in their interactions with their children by their roles in other microsystems to which they belong, such as workplace, community, and religious organizations. And these in turn are subject to interaction with larger units in the more encompassing circles. As we have seen in the various responses to the COVID-19 pandemic in the US, major change occurred in the interactions within families when the pandemic took away the jobs of many parents and other adults and when schools were closed. Even when jobs were not lost, parents experienced enormous stress when they had to work at home and at the same time supervise their children's education. Shock waves of disruption rippled throughout all the circles. A major disruption to the system reveals the multiple links of interdependence that were there all along, but which are normally taken for granted and not much noticed. Culture has a crucial role in forming the links of interdependence throughout society. As Bronfenbrenner developed his theory, he desired to emphasize the role of individuals themselves, and that influence between them and their circles was fully mutual. This is in accord with the individual agency to which both Confucians and Neo-Confucians gave a central role. Furthermore, some theorists influenced by seminal figures such as Vygotsky criticized Bronfenbrenner's seeming isolation of culture as a property of the largest circle, thus neglecting the way that culture is involved in the way individuals interact with and influence each other within their microsystems through socially established and inherited routines, such as getting up in the morning and dressing, preparing meals, chores, homework, and bedtime. This latter point, of course, resonates very much with the cultivational importance placed on ritual, especially in the Analects and the Xunzi. But these works go several steps further in rightly exploring the possibilities of becoming self-aware of the routines that structure everyday life, and the way that they can be made to express, cultivate, and reinforce values governing relationships. The Confucians envisioned very clearly the way that individuals could exercise their own agency in interacting with and influencing others through the way they imbued their performance of roles and rituals with their personal style and their sense of how they ought to conduct their relationship with others in those roles and rituals. A great advantage of the Confucian conception of one body is that it allows for a kind of oneness that need not be uniformity or sameness, but that takes advantage of our differences, such that we contribute different strengths and make up for each other's inevitable limitations. I will address this in more detail in the last lecture, but for now, let us note that in contemporary political psychology, there is a trend of studies trying to connect certain psychological dispositions, such as openness to change and to novelty and tolerance of ambiguity and uncertainty on the one hand, and decisiveness, conscientiousness, aversion to change, and preference for the familiar and for order on the other hand, with political liberalism and conservatism, respectively. There is a further attempt to link the difference in dispositions with biological genetic differences. It has been argued that biologically based psychological differences resulting in different political orientations might make sense from an evolutionary point of view. A variety of psychological types might be adaptive in the highly heterogeneous environments in which human beings evolved. It may be more useful than not to have a polymorphism of psychological types in human groups, which predispose individuals towards particular social and moral attitudes and behaviors. The biological and evolutionary theses are still highly speculative at this point, but it's still plausible that different psychological tendencies, whether the origin is biological, experiential, and cultural, or most likely interaction of all these factors, might show themselves as useful to human groups in their need to adapt to changing and heterogeneous circumstances. And it suggests why interdependence between different kinds of individuals could be a stable characteristic of human communities. Human beings bring a diverse set of dispositions to the problems of fulfilling their needs through cooperation. For example, at different times or from different people, they can draw from the curious and exploratory tendencies of some to discover new resources, or the cautious and protective tendencies of others to defend against predators or aggression from other communities. But precisely because these tendencies can overlap and be activated by the same situations, it is also plausible that such complementarity could quickly turn into conflict and disagreement as to what the appropriate response is for the community. Interdependence between individuals with different perceptual and action tendencies can both be highly fruitful and fraught at the same time. That is why harmony in the sense of shared understanding, disagreement, contest, and accommodation, can rest on a delicate balance that must be continually striven for and reset under changing circumstances. If we do not subscribe to a Neo-Confucian metaphysics that fosters belief in the availability of an ultimate harmony that we struggle to achieve through clarification of our turbid chi, then we must struggle to achieve as much of it as we can create for ourselves, with no assurance that it can be achieved or that it could be sustained indefinitely if achieved, or that it will take the same form it once had. Our collective state would be much more precarious and existential. Jung and Shu as values governing relationships of interdependence. Having put some distance between the approach employed here and the metaphysical commitments of the Neo-Confucians, I do want to point out that their conceptions of moral cultivation remain potentially relevant. This is in part because their conception of Li, pattern, is of an order immanent within the world that only becomes apparent from clarifying the muddy chi within which it is embodied. What the Neo-Confucians conceive as clarifying and making manifest an immanent pattern is something that can be reconceived as the effort of human beings to conceive and construct an order which can be characterized as a kind of harmony that was described in the last lecture. It is reaching a shared understanding or accommodation while also engaging in disagreement and contest, striving to bring these into balance. One of the methods that appear in the Analects and taken up in Juxi's commentary is Shu, which is frequently paired with Jung. Shu is subject to a number of translations, but as I said earlier, I render it as sympathetic understanding. Because it highlights that aspect of its meaning, I shall make special use of. Jung is, again, subject to a number of translations. I render it as conscientiousness or doing one's best in serving others. In 1524, Zhegung asked whether there is a single word that can serve as a guide throughout one's life. Confucius replies, "It is sympathetic understanding, Shu. What you do not want, do not do to others." 12.2 associates this negative golden rule, as it's often called, with Ren without naming it Shu. In 5.12, Zhegung says that what he does not want others to do to him, he does not do to others. And Confucius replies that this is quite beyond his reach. In 6.30, Confucius says that a Ren person wishing to establish themselves also seeks to establish others, and in wishing to be prominent also helps others to be prominent. This is often called the positive golden rule. The passage goes on to say that to be able to draw from what is close as an analogy is called the method of Ren. Finally, the doctrine of the mean, Jung says that Jung and Shu are not far from the way, Tao. What you do not want, do not do to others. It is further said in this passage that there are 4 things in the way of the exemplary person: to serve my father as I would expect my son to serve me, to serve my ruler as I would expect my minister to serve me, to serve elder brothers as I expect younger brothers to treat me, and to treat my friends as I expect my friends to serve me. This part is a statement of the negative golden rule, and I take the second 4-part message to be an explication of Jung as doing one's best and serving others as guided by the positive golden rule. Views as to the relation of Shu to the positive golden rule vary. Some equate the positive golden rule with Jung and restrict Shu to the negative golden rule. I view Shu as comprehending both the negative and positive versions, and view Jung as doing one's best in serving others. I take the relation between Jung and Shu to be one in which the former is guided by both the negative and positive versions of analogy from what is close. A common criticism of the Golden Rule, whether in its Confucian embodiment or in Western traditions, is that it is peculiarly lacking as a guide to conduct. A naive reading of that rule would have us treat others as we would desire to be treated. But the criticism goes, what one wants or would want is not a reliable guide to how one should treat others. One may have wants undeserving of satisfaction, and what might be appropriate to want in one's own situation may be inappropriate for another to want in their situation. All this criticism, I suspect, stems from treating shu as a standalone moral rule, divorced from all values, virtues, and other forms of moral guidance provided by Confucianism. It is also based on a simplistic conception of how to use analogy as a method of moral reasoning. Let us first consider the issue of whether shu should be treated as a standalone moral rule. The liabilities, if it were so meant, are obvious, and on grounds of charity alone, we should look for alternative interpretations. Pause here, I just realized I had the wrong tone mark on zhong, so I corrected that. The fact that several of the quoted passages confer a central place to shu or to zhong and shu does not mean that they have to stand alone. It might rather mean that they play some organizing role in bringing other values, virtues, and forms of moral guidance into a more coherent relationship with each other. To begin to see how it might play such a role, first consider how one should apply the analogy from what's close to others. The sense in which we are called upon to reflect on what we wish or want, yu, for ourselves, is a sense in which the analects begins, where we are asked whether it is indeed not pleasant to learn and to practice repeatedly what one has learned, whether it is not delightful to have friends come to visit from afar, and to be untroubled when not recognized by others. Is this not the mark of an exemplary person? It is a sense in which, in 526, when Confucius asked Yan Hui and Zilu to speak of their aspirations, their ji, Zilu speaks of sharing his chariots, horses, clothing, and furs with his friends, while Yan Hui wishes never to brag of his excellence or to make display of his accomplishments. But Confucius himself answers that he wishes to comfort the aged, to engender trust in his friends, and to nurture the young. The sense in which one is bidden to reflect on what is close is to reflect on what aspirations one has to make the most of one's life as a human being. To recognize that this is where we begin our analogy is to see the irrelevance of the objection that what one happens to want is not a good guide, either for oneself or for others. If we are to construe the analogy to be made in terms of the source target domain terminology, we are bidden to reflect within the source domain on what we most truly want for ourselves. I take it that such knowledge of one's deepest desires is not at all something that can be taken for granted as available to us, as the differences between Zilu, Yan Hui, and Confucius's answers reveal. The student's answers are not so much wrong, but rather seem too specific and too small in scope compared to the largeness, the completeness, and at the same time profound simplicity of Confucian's vision of a life of relationship with others. Of course, Confucius can mention the aspiration for attaining high enough political office so that one can make a significant contribution to the country's rediscovering the Tao. But we know that whether he can realize that aspiration is sadly beyond his control. And the life he mentions is one that any exemplary person can attain unless they are extremely unfortunate. Knowledge that the life he mentions is supremely worth desiring and living, knowledge that effectively guides one's actions and interactions with others, is knowledge to be sought over a lifetime. And as one attains a greater degree of it, one is better able to realize Zhong, Mark, and Shu. The knowledge gained here is knowledge of what is best and most to be desired for the self. It takes work to fully realize the value of one's own life. In other words, a failure to recognize the full value of the lives of others can be rooted in a failure to recognize the value of one's own life. To play off an example from Mengzi, to sell one's life for a beautiful mansion or many concubines is to sell it far too cheaply. Often, we act misguidedly out of our most intense impulses or obsessions, not for the sake of a well-founded concern for our own well-being. In using analogy from what is close to act in the interests of others, to do our best in serving them, we must understand well our own interests. As Justin Tiwold has articulated in his work on Daijun, we must care about our own lives and what makes them truly fulfilling. We are best able to assess what conduces to our fulfillment in calmer, reflective moments, Jing, unagitated by turbulent impulses, though we may be reflecting on moments of agitation and the results of acting on them compared to our moments of restraint. To extend from what is close, then, requires deep and sustained reflection on the source domain, one's own thoughts and desires for the self, and whatever wisdom might be gleaned from one's experiences over a lifetime, one's successes, the more frequent failures, and the regrets. Care must also be taken in extending to the target domain, because one must recognize differences in interests over people, because of differences in life circumstances, in formative experiences, in social roles, and in temperament. One can wrongly extend or misanalogize from the self in countless ways. To extend accurately, one must not only identify relevant similarities to the other, but relevant dissimilarities. Moreover, one must not be too quick to judge the dissimilarities in terms unfavorable to the other. In the Analects, Confucius often seems to emphasize a particular teaching to the student he believes needs that teaching the most. Thus, to Zilu, Confucius brings home the need to know when one knows something, to know when one does not know, to think and plan before one acts, and to learn. To Zigong, significantly, he emphasizes Shu, and when Zigong uses the negative golden rule to describe what he does, Confucius comments that this is something that is beyond Zigong's reach. At one point, Confucius rather comments with irritation on Zigong's habit of judging others negatively, as if looking down upon them. This is why I prefer the translation of sympathetic understanding for Shu. Such understanding of another is not to be reserved solely for the ways in which the other is similar to oneself. One must use both similarities and dissimilarities with the other to do one's best in serving them. The similarities help one to identify those aspects of life fulfillment that one shares with others. The differences help one to see how those aspects might be realized differently for the other. To make this kind of judgment, one must do one's best to try to see the world and oneself as the other sees the world and the self. As in lecture 1, I observed the more complex ways in which metaphor and analogy can travel back and forth between source and target domains. This applies to sympathetic understanding as well. I may carry from my source domain a sense of what constitutes my truest life fulfillment and extend it by analogy to the other. But in reflecting on the target domain, I may realize a lack of fit with the other's interests and motivations. I may conclude that there is a relevant difference between myself and the other in this regard. Or alternatively, or in addition, I may be led to rethink my initial conception of my own life fulfillment. The other's aspirations may teach me something about myself I had not considered before. Amy Oberding has written persuasively of the complementary contrast between the characters of Zilu and Zigong. She suggests that behind Zigong's condescending attitude towards others may lie in insecurity and defensiveness that results in a desire to present a too perfect outward appearance, a trait that manifests in a fussy concern to get the technical details of ritual just right. While Zilu presents all too apparent faults in his impulsiveness and impatience with learning and planning, his comfort with himself and lack of pretense in front of others is deeply appealing. My attempt to sympathetically understand these two people and others in my life who are like them has made me realize that I am more like Zegung than I would like to be, and that I aspire to be more like Zilu, though hopefully without the thoughtlessness. Sometimes realizing what desires and aspirations I share with others helps me to properly assess their importance relative to other desires and aspirations I have. C.P. Ellis, the Klansman discussed in the previous lecture, had been consumed with acting from his resentments towards Black people. However, when he heard Black parents express complaints about the way their children were treated at school, and when he realized he could have said exactly the same thing, and furthermore, when he realized he shared with Ann Atwater the sense of deep shame over not being able to defend his children from mistreatment at school, he realized that these aims were truly the most important thing he could do something about, and that he could join in common purpose with the Black working class community. Davidson's recounting of Ellis's and Atwater's conversation, a pivotal conversation they had, is worth quoting. CP could not believe what he was hearing, but even more amazing to him was what he was saying and to whom. He was sharing his most intimate grievances, all his doubts and failures, with the hated Ann Atwater, the militant he usually referred to with a sneer as that N-word. And yet here they were talking like old friends, as if she wasn't Black at all, or he wasn't white, or as if that didn't matter. He looked at her and it was as if he were seeing her for the first time. He was stunned by what he saw. Mirrored in her face were the same deeply etched lines of work and worry that marked his own face, and suddenly he was crying. The tears came without warning, and once started, he was unable to stop them. Anne was dumbfounded, but she reacted instinctively by reaching out and taking his hand in her own. She tried to comfort him, stroking his hand and murmuring, it's okay," as he stopped. Then she too began to cry. In the more complex process in which I go back and forth between the person I am and the other for whom I am trying to envision what it is to be that person, I may approach the intimate and unmediated response of feeling the other's suffering as if it were my own. However, it can never be a complete merger. If I can learn something about myself from reflecting on both my similarities and my differences with them, if I can bring that back to better judging how to act towards them, I cannot be completely merging my awareness of who I am with my awareness of who they are. Nor would it be desirable to always feel their suffering fully as much my own. Given the cruelty of the world we live in, such sensitivity would instantaneously be overwhelming and paralyzing, at least for me, and I suspect most people. The need to protect one's sensitivity to suffering through avoiding overexposure is what prompted Mengzi to say to King Xian that King Xian was justified to spare the ox from suffering, even though he did not dispute the practice of ritual sacrifice in general. At the same time, we often need to be reminded of the reality of other people's and animal suffering, most especially when we can do something about it. And the Confucian method of implementing Zhong through Shu is relevant now as it ever was. Further extending Zhong and Shu. There are several respects, however, in which the method of extending oneself to others through sympathetic understanding needs further development. First, serious attention needs to be paid to the difficulties of extending the care developed among family members and small circles of intimates to those outside the family. Confucians endorse the idea that caring should be graded, that what one owes to others varies according to the nature of one's relationship to them. At the same time, graded caring affirms that we do owe substantial care to everyone. The Confucian response to these twin requirements is to propose that one extend a good deal, if not all of one's care to everyone along the lines of analogy. As I have indicated in a previous lecture, care for a stranger stands a better chance of being effective if one can fill in one's picture of the stranger as someone's child, sibling, parent, spouse, grandparent, or great-grandparent. It is not abstract acknowledgement of such truths that is needed, but the extension of that feeling of a stranger suffering to feeling as if were one's own. However, achievement of this ideal has been the sporadic exception rather than the rule. In Confucianism, I suspect that a large part of the problem has been its dependence on the strategy of inducing change from the top down, from a centralized source, in the king or the king and ministers. Direction and guidance emanates from a centralized source, and there is great distance from that source to daily life at the local level, where the family and clan hold sway. To be directed by a central authority to extend to distant others, the feeling of suffering as if it were one's own is too often a kind of abstract demand from this centralized source. The US has periodically seen calls to institute a national service, and one of the main reasons is that such a service would draw people outside their usual circles of friendship and acquaintance. A further advantage is that it draws them into common projects with each other, thus providing additional motivations and opportunity for sustained interaction with people from groups and backgrounds they may not even have met before. Such service could be mandatory or voluntary, depending on which arrangement is made feasible by the country's cultural and political traditions. The most realistic scenario for a national service in the US is one that makes the participation voluntary, but mandatory forms will be feasible for countries with a stronger cultural tradition centered on the common good. There is a worry that racially and ethnically diverse societies cannot accommodate difference. The sociologist Robert Putnam's 2007 study found that diverse communities will tend to be lower in the social goods comprising social capital, such as reciprocity and trust. However, Putnam cites not simply diversity, but contention over limited resources as a primary factor in divisiveness. He also observes, and this is very much congenial to a Confucian perspective, that a century ago, shared identities were promoted within, quote, community centers, athletic fields, and schools, unquote, that they were, quote, among the most efficacious instruments for incorporating new immigrants, unquote, and that, quote, we need to reinvest in such places and activities once again, enabling us to become comfortable with diversity, unquote. We need to repurpose critical institutions where people of diverse backgrounds meet and join in common purpose. As the story of Ellis and Atwater and the desegregation of Durham public schools illustrates, schools distribute learning, skills, goods, and opportunities to children that greatly matter to their families. Institutions where people have a large stake are far more likely to attract participation and effective investment. Rituals and social grammar deployed at such sites of interaction between diverse groups can make for friendly contact. Teachers are critical in introducing and sustaining a social grammar for the classroom and interactions between students and their families of diverse backgrounds. We need to forge interdependencies of the right kind. There are now teaching methods featuring students who learn from each other in teams, and in which the success of the individual student depends on cooperation with all other members of the team. Such methods create motivation to make interdependencies work and foster the skills necessary to make them work. Preliminary and recently published findings of a study in the US by social scientists point to the quality and friendliness of the interactions between groups in Philadelphia and Atlanta as conducive to trust and civic engagement in workplaces, neighborhoods, and public spaces. Among two immigrant groups, Mexicans and South Asians, and two native-born groups of whites and blacks, trust increased with greater face-to-face contact, and there were secondary transfer effects in the sense that friendly contact with one group increased trust in other groups. Schools, workplaces, neighborhoods, and public spaces are critical sites for people of different backgrounds to practice shu towards one another, to use what they have learned of themselves to envision what it might be like for others in their distinct circumstances, and to learn potentially new things about what they themselves might value from reflecting on what it might be like to live the lives of others. A series of experiments called Deliberative Polling has produced promising results across the world by bringing together people of diverse backgrounds to discuss issues, many of which provoke vehement and entrenched disagreement, such as energy policy, immigration, and what to do about crime. Inspired by the ancient Athenian assembly of citizens who gathered to vote on laws, war, and foreign policy, the political scientist James Fishkin conceived of events in which citizens convened, typically for a weekend, to deliberate over such issues. They were chosen on the basis of random representative samplings and supplied with briefing materials on the issues, talks given by experts, and part of the time met in small discussion groups led by trained moderators. They were polled for their views at the beginning and at the end, and the results typically showed significant change. A concrete example of when such events had significant impact is the deliberative polling done in the American state of Texas on the issue of energy policies. This produced significant shifts in citizens' opinions on the viability of wind power, resulting in Texas utilities and government regulators should read, investing in wind power. Understanding why others disagree. Let's go back to the component of harmony that is the ability to accommodate disagreement. In the previous lecture, I pointed to studies indicating that diverse groups are better at performing their tasks. Their performance is enhanced when they can expect that their individual contributions will not be dismissed by other members, but instead received with a measure of sympathy and effort to understand their point of view. When Google put a lot of money into discovering what made for the most effective teams, it found that the crucial difference was not having the most talented team members, but how the team worked together and whether the climate was one of psychological safety, mutual respect, and interpersonal trust in which everyone could speak their mind. In other words, members of the most effective teams displayed a higher degree of social sensitivity to each other. This, of course, is where the method of Jung and Shu is highly relevant. The draw from what is close in a way that will help one understand others may require one to understand how their experience and circumstances can be quite different from one's own and yet similar in other and yet profound respects. C.P. Ellis and M. Atwater were vehement antagonists until they realized that both Black and white working class children were similarly ill-served and mistreated by public school teachers and administrators. A crucial turning point in their relationship was an incident in which Black students were about to tear up literature that Ellis had set up in a display on the Klan at the Chariot. It was Atwater who stopped them from doing it, advising them that they should read the pamphlets and know what the Klan was thinking so they could be prepared for it. Ellis saw her and saved his Klan exhibit, and that started to change his attitude towards her. Each meeting of the 10-day Chariot, moreover, ended with gospel singing by the Black parents. Ellis began clapping his hands and moving his feet to the music, and when the Black parents noted he was not clapping in time with the music, they taught him how. Now, of course, one cannot ask African Americans to defend the literature of hate groups what Anne Atwater did was extraordinary and supererogatory, or in the eyes of some of her critics within African American communities, very mistaken. But for those of us who can offer shoe to those on the other side of a divide, may be the best way to change minds. It is often curiosity expressed about why someone holds the view they have, not argument against it, that can make people more receptive to alternative viewpoints. Beliefs are adopted and sustained because they are badges of membership in a community. To change those beliefs is significant because it may mean giving up that membership. To change them is more feasible if one has alternative communities to join, and that is precisely what happened to C.P. Ellis. When he was initiated into the Klan, he was told that he would never be alone again. He recalled that he was so happy that he was in tears. The occasion on which Ellis joined with Black parents in gospel singing signified his possible entry into an alternative community. Mercier and Sperber marshal a wide swath of studies in cognitive psychology to argue that the primary evolved function of reason is to persuade, not to find the truth. The evidence ranges from the well-known phenomenon of confirmation bias, that people mainly look for reasons to support their current views and ignore reasons that undermine those views, to the finding that people are quite bad at constructing arguments in the abstract, but markedly improve when they are in a group discussing and debating with others. While one should have reservations about the way that Mercier and Sperber reify reason and its primary function, they rightly draw attention to the impressive evidence for the prevalence of persuasion rather than truth-seeking as a motivation. Rather than controlling our tribal psychologies, reason is often the tool by which we persuade others to join our tribes, to justify what we do for our tribes against others, and to show why the other tribes are wrong. This generalization applies in no lesser degree to what goes on in the professional journals of philosophy. Persuasion may not be the function of reason, but it is one of the primary uses. Of course, I'm not saying that we should cease trying to find the truth, but in seeking to change other people's minds to better accord with what we see to be the truth, a less aggressive frontal assault on their current beliefs, and the more sincere curiosity as to why they believe what they do may be far more effective. The less we take others as the other, the less defensive a stance we will take towards them. To return to the Confucian idea of extending care within the family to outside the family, we must try to fill in one's picture of the stranger as someone's child, sibling, parent, spouse, grandparent, or great-grandparent. To recall one of the significant moments of conversation between Ellis and Atwater, the more one can look into the other's face and see the lines of work and worry that are etched into one's own, the more one can see the other as one of us. Rituals of protest for the integration of disagreement and contest into the harmony of one body. It is usual to regard rituals as practices that strengthen social bonds of respect and mutual concern through practices such as ways to greet guests and to commemorate the lives of those who have contributed to the community. In diverse and pluralistic societies, however, it is necessary to have practices for people to protest if they feel they have not been fairly heard through other channels of communication. These practices are acts of intentional but peaceful and limited disruption, such as the peaceful violation of laws, and such intent is conveyed through willing acceptance of the punishment. When patterns of such conduct become established and employed by protesting groups, and when those meant to receive the message can be expected through the dispersion of cultural knowledge to understand the intended message, we have rituals of protest. Mohandas Gandhi's Salt March in 1930, which is pictured here on the right, is correctly taken as a seminal moment in the contemporary history of ritual protest. The prohibition on Indians against collecting and selling salt and attacks on their forced purchase of salt from British authorities that was especially burdensome to the poor, prompted Gandhi to lead a march for a symbolic taking of salt, during which thousands joined him, resulting in the arrest of nearly 60,000, including Gandhi himself. That protest was an inspiration for marches for civil rights and sit-ins at whites-only eating establishments and in whites-only sections of buses to protest segregation in the United States. And the picture on the right here on the bottom is the Selma to Montgomery March. And now at the top is a picture of a sit-in at Greensboro cafeteria, Woolworth's cafeteria. Key figures in the American Civil Rights Movement, including John Haynes Holmes, beginning in the 1920s, W.E.B. Du Bois and Martin Luther King Jr., were deeply influenced by Gandhi. In the American South, the public violation of segregation law and willingness of protesters to be arrested was an act of appeal to the consciences of the white majority and to their Mungsian sense of shame. Consider the kneeling of African-American football players during the playing of the American national anthem to protest the killing of Black African-Americans by police. Such an act would not have the ritual meaning it has, were it not that the standard form is to stand facing the flag. Of course, the meaning of that ritual protest has been contested, with some choosing to portray it as disrespectful to members of the military. But kneeling has symbolically carried the meaning of veneration and respect for something beyond the individual. One of the first players to kneel, Eric Reed, has explained that he and teammate Colin Kaepernick expressly chose kneeling as their gesture precisely because it did connote respect. We should expect political contest to carry over into construal of the meaning of rituals of protest, and we should be prepared to correct mistaken or intentional distortions. Last year, a movement symbolized by and in large part led by the organization Black Lives Matter has swept across the United States, sparked by the starkly graphic video of a Black man, George Floyd, pleading for his life and calling out for his dead mother while a police officer's knee is being applied to his neck and back after being forced to lie face down on the ground with his hands handcuffed behind his back. A look of casual indifference on the officer's face with his hands in his pockets while pressing down with his weight on Floyd for over 9 minutes. The action was unmistakable in its needless and callous cruelty. It was not subject to second guessing about a possibly exonerating chain of events leading up to it. It came after a series of seemingly endless incidents in which the lives of Black people were taken by police. The video recording of this incident sparked spontaneous demonstrations, not only in large cities and not only among Black Americans, but among white Americans and other people of color in small towns with heavily white majority populations, and then to other countries such as the UK and Germany. This is a picture of a demonstration in Berlin. Here, there was something like the intimate and unmediated response to harm done to another, witnessed in vivid fashion. And for many, not because of personal relationship to the one harmed, but perhaps because of a felt accountability as a citizen of a country that has long profited from the oppression of Black people. It is a sign of our distance from strangers separated by racial difference that it took such a graphic switch of perspectives to come remotely near to experiencing another's suffering as if it were one's own. To appreciate what a distance it was to travel to such a point, consider that it was not that long ago that white people would bring their children to festive gatherings to watch Black people being lynched. Viewing practices of protest as rituals is in line with one fruitful way of thinking about ritual within the Confucian tradition that has been advanced by Michael Ng in interpretation of the Li Ji, the record of ritual. On this view, rituals are a way to negotiate the tension between the dysfunctional world and the desire to enact what we want it to be. Ritual is a way of coming to terms with the way the world inevitably upsets and destroys whatever order and proportion we have created or aspire to in our lives. Thus, the civil rights activists who embarked on freedom rides on interstate buses in the segregated southern United States in the 1960s picture here on the right, were a protest of the non-enforcement of Supreme Court decisions ruling that declared segregated public buses to be unconstitutional. Southern states ignored those rulings and the federal government did not enforce them. The Freedom Riders challenged this dysfunction in the world by riding interstate buses in mixed racial groups. They enacted a dramatic call of the nation's attention to a state of disorder or oppressive order, but they also enacted how they thought things ought to be. When Colin Kaepernick and Eric Reed kneeled during the national anthem, they introduced a significant variation in the ritual script of standing to attention to the flag and the national anthem. But in their view, it was appropriate to adjust in the script, to make an adjustment in the script, to call attention to the disorder of police, not only failing to protect the communities they were supposed to serve, but killing its members. The Black Lives Matter demonstrations were protests of the disordered state of US society, but consisted of perhaps the most racially mixed demonstrations since the civil rights demonstrations of the 1960s. In that sense, they were an enactment of how things ought to be. Interdependence with the non-human. It has become clear that due to human activity, the Earth's climate is changing faster than at any point in the history of modern civilization. The effects will be uneven and, to a significant extent, reinforce the global inequalities we currently witness. Developing societies and the most vulnerable people within them will suffer the most because they have fewer resources to adapt to disruptions in their capacities to produce food, clean water, energy, and to protect public health. The chain of interdependencies, however, will put pressure on societies and the people in them who have more resources. In the end, no society will be safe from the severe impact of climate change. At the same time, more and more of the Earth's population is living in urban, massively built human environments. More and more of us are dependent on insulating ourselves within artificial cocoons, depriving ourselves of identification with and sensitivity to the natural non-human world at a time when human activity is threatening to produce massive change to that world and degrading that variability to sustain ourselves within our artificial environments. To break this cycle, we must cultivate our sense of interdependence with the non-human world, as we must cultivate a sense of interdependence with strangers in the human world. The Bio-Regionalism movement in the US takes this insight as central, suggesting that greater rootedness in place, greater involvement with community, and more locally grounded knowledge leads to greater appreciation and respect for the environment. Rather than seeing nature as a sacred part of the world that needs to be kept free from human intervention, bioregionalism seeks harmony between nature and human society and culture. Another element of the bioregionalist view is the idea that sustainability can more easily be accomplished at the regional level. For example, eating local and seasonal foods can foster farmers' engagement with and commitment to the communities they serve, as well as the community's interest in sustaining local farms, sensitivity to social and environmental concerns. The last study is crucial. It's not only smaller scale, more energetically efficient economies that improve the prospects for achieving sustainability. The mechanisms of accountability at local scales also play a critical role. Bio-regionalists suggest that making visible the processes of production and the consequences of excess consumption can lead people to consider their choices in a more reflective light. Ecological restoration is another strand of the American environmental movement that resonates with a relational approach, or interdependent approach. Restoration includes a wide range of activities, from revitalizing polluted urban streams to planting native species to recreating areas of tall grass prairie. One of the themes that has propelled the development of such initiatives is the idea that restoration can not only rehabilitate ecosystems, but also renew individuals and communities by establishing more positive relationships between people and the places they inhabit. This emphasis on relationship and reciprocity permeates urban restoration initiatives today. In Durham, North Carolina, the Allerby Creek Watershed Association is dedicated to restoring the creek and renewing the urban community as mutually supportive and interdependent projects. The association encourages the development of individual and community identities that encompass the creek. For example, individuals can adopt a section of stream in which to monitor the water quality, and educational programs emphasize the connections between stormwater runoff and the creek's health, encouraging organizations and individuals to landscape their property in ways that promote absorption of rainfall instead of its collection in storm sewers. Restoration of the creek depends on people seeing themselves as inhabitants of the Allerby Creek watershed, as embedded in the hydrologic processes that include the creek and that are tied to vegetation, urban development, and human activities. Once these sensitivities to local and regional interdependencies between the human and the natural are cultivated, their scope must be extended in widening circles. Our connections to other humans and other parts of the world can be extended to include their connections to the natural. Tourism has been both a disaster and a boon to the human relationship with nature. At its best, it can be a way for people to appreciate how cultures other than their own relate to nature, as well as the beauty of natural places in regions other than their own. And for local people to steward places of natural beauty that does not involve extracting fossil fuels that contribute to global warming. At its worst, it can destroy the beauty through overconstruction of infrastructure for tourism, such as roads and hotels, and through giving rise to the economic exploitation of local people. Besides assuring that the attempts to extend sensitivities to the human-nature interdependencies in constructive directions, we must address the fact that not everyone will readily acknowledge the importance of the non-human environment to themselves, especially those accustomed to living in human-made environments. However, just as there are biologically based dispositions, sprouts, that can be cultivated to foster a connection to other human beings, there are also sprouts that form the basis for harmony between the human and the natural. The energizing and uplifting effect of sunlight on mood is often noted, as is the depressing effect of sunlight dimmed or darkened. And both very likely are effects of a biological constitution stemming from our hunter-gatherer origins. There is evidence that contact with animals, plants, landscapes, and wilderness can, under the right conditions, reduce stress, promote feelings of calm and well-being, faster healing from physical ailments, and facilitate recovery from mental fatigue. Landscapes that evoke some of the most positive response from people are savanna-like, and again may reflect a biological heritage from human hunter-gatherer origins. Contact with horses, dolphins, and other animals may help heal both physical and emotional wounds. There is a basis for developing a stronger sense of interdependency with nature than we have now. Consideration of an objection. To close this lecture, I would like to consider an objection to the way I've been interpreting the ideal of harmony and of the one body. It might be said that my interpretation of harmony does not give sufficient weight to the preference for stability and conservatism that has been associated with Confucianism, nor does it give sufficient weight to the broad extent of shared understanding that has been thought to be necessary for such stability and conservatism. Scholarly and popular views of what is Confucian have been heavily influenced by its having been and become official state ideology starting from the Han Dynasty. In the process of its institutionalization, Confucianism was fused with thinking from Fajia philosophers who emphasized centralized authority, harsh punishments, and skepticism about the power of trust between rulers and people to secure social order. These philosophers, such as Han Fei, would have disdained the way I've incorporated dimensions of contest and accommodation and ritual protest into Confucian ideals. However, one virtue of paying serious attention to the seminal texts of a tradition is to recapture a set of possible and important meanings that get obscured by the traditions being used to legitimate a set of compromised institutional arrangements. I do not mean to defend a pristine version of Confucianism, because there is none. It is now commonplace to recognize the Analects as a confluence of different streams of thought from different and numerous individuals and groups over a long stretch of time, such that the Confucius of that text is more of a corporate person before there were corporations. The Mengzi not only defends Confucianism against its greatest rival during the ancient era, Moism, but incorporates to a very significant degree Moism's overriding concern to satisfy the basic material needs of people. And the Mengzi does so, as Joanne Birdwhistle argues, through appropriating for its version of Confucian ethics engendered characteristics associated with women, such as compassion and the nurturing of living beings. According to patterns of development, one cannot bend to one's will or force to grow faster by pulling them upwards with the hand. In these regards, Mengzian Confucian ethics differ significantly from the ethics of the Analects and from the ethics of the Xunzi that came later on. The Xunzi, in turn, incorporates concepts into its epistemology that we have come to associate with Taoism. And of course, the Neo-Confucian movement of the Chinese Middle Ages significantly reinterpreted the classical texts. And indeed, it designated which were canonical and which were not in the light of its own fusion of classical Confucian ethics with elements of Taoism and Buddhism. My plea, therefore, is for recognizing the internal diversity and fluidity of great traditions of thought as embodied in their texts, each text containing within itself and in relation to each other more than one viable set of coherent meanings. These meanings are eligible for fusion with meanings from other texts. Each set of meanings represents somewhat different directions of development for the tradition. Some emerge as dominant, but others may later receive renewed attention because the problems of the times prompt attention to them. Confucianism shows itself to be a living and still viable tradition to the extent that its interpreters draw from the different possible lines of development with an eye toward their applicability to their own current situation. In her account of how Chinese thinkers in the late 19th century and early 20th centuries approached the task of bringing to bear Western thought to the reform of their own society, Li Jianko points out that a crucial part of their task was to identify what their own cultural inheritance was, such that it could be brought into relation to a present and future that involved possibly profound transformation. She points out that, quote, Confucius offered one of the earliest accounts of how an orientation to a particular past could be both deliberate and transformative, rather than merely descriptive of an established identity, unquote. And that his conception of the Zhou inheritance was but, quote, one of many possible lineages created when the present was sutured to that particular past, unquote. Sorhun Tan makes a similar point in claiming that the Confucian legacy is successfully transmitted only when the past is revitalized so that it is embodied in the different experience of the present. Confucius himself may be regarded as a source of this interpretive method when he says that one who revitalizes the old to realize the new is worthy of being a teacher. In the last lecture, I shall propose an integration of Taoist and Confucian insights into governance within the person and state and society.